Hey everybody, I hope you're doing well and having a great day. Wanted to just offer you some information specifically about reflecting meaning and summarizing in session. So the question is, why reflect meaning in a counseling session? Part of why we're going to reflect meaning is because the reflection of meaning is a significant step beyond content and emotion because it taps the unique worldview of the client. If we know the meaning of the story, we will know why the client is troubled by it. This answers that question that we tell you not to ask the client, why are we talking about this? So, meaning and depth. So, there's some things that we need to kind of take into consideration when talking about depth. And we talked about depth in earlier conversations, but this is kind of a way to move towards understanding and how to kind of take a step-by-step process to assess for depth or explore depth with the client. So the first question we're going to figure out is what happened. The second is how do you feel about what happened? And then the third is what did it mean or what does it mean to you? So in the beginning of the therapeutic relationship, quite often we're going to find that how far we can go in terms of depth is probably going to be superficial, mainly because we don't have a lot of information about the client and the circumstances around what happened to them. As trust builds in the therapeutic relationship, meaning is going to deepen and should deepen. And this is going to flow back and forth, and it's not uncommon for depth to go shallow to deep throughout the session. So if you kind of think about it as like a person that is an undersea diver, a lot of times the first time that they are using their scuba gear and exploring or maybe snorkeling, they're not going to necessarily go to the very deepest point in the water initially. They might kind of hang out, then they'll test the waters and continue to go down and then come back up and go down, quite often pacing themselves through the process based on what's happening with the client. So here's the question: why should we care about the meaning behind the client story? First off, the client may be unaware of the significance of events, reactions, history, and what they have to do with a current or ongoing presenting problem. The question is, how has their experiences impacted how they construct their own story? And reflection of meaning is an opportunity for the client to look in the mirror and see a clear reflection of self. The depth that a client is willing to reveal is dependent on a number of factors. Among these are helper responses, client readiness, and willingness, and some attributes of the therapeutic relationship. Quite often, beginning level helpers, so individuals that are in your chair, move to fix before understanding the meaning. And we've talked about that in residency, and we'll talk about that throughout your training and development. You want to make sure that you don't move to fix before understanding the meaning. So we talk about this idea of inner circles, and this is a concept introduced by an individual by the name of Arnold Lazarus, and he used the inner circle to identify deeper, more personal issues. So when would you potentially use this? And there's going to be a handout attached to the contact / link to this PowerPoint that is going to provide you with additional information. So if you open up that attachment, thinking about when you would use this. And I've actually printed this off and used this in session when exploring, when people say that they only have a limited amount of people that they feel connected to, but they're wanting to make themselves more vulnerable or open up. So I'll use that activity. But the reason for including this particular attachment in the discussion about meaning is that we want to kind of explore where we're at in the process and what we would need to do to get closer, because ring A is considered very personal and ring E is considered known to all. So something that we might talk about in terms of the Johari's window as well. So part of your responsibility is to identify who has access to various rings and what it is that they're providing to the client that is going to allow them to open up and feel supported in their process, and trust or feel what makes them feel capable of being vulnerable to the individual that is in ring A. So the other thing we want to kind of take into consideration is what's called the client's worldview. And this refers to a person's view of self, how they view others and the world, and one's values about what is right and wrong. So, as a counselor, it is your job to understand both the client's worldview and values so that the client's viewpoint, not the counselor's, and the meaning of their story is woven throughout the sessions and potential solutions for the issue. One of the challenges that we often face as counselors is that we will focus more on what we think is wrong and how we would handle a situation or how we might feel if a circumstance were to happen to us. And we don't take into consideration that that's really about us and not about the client. And we want to make sure that we're constantly working to understand the worldview from the client and their values, especially when reflecting meaning to the client in session. So how do you reflect meaning? So you're going to thoroughly examine who the client is, where they are coming from, and what their experiences, values, and beliefs may be. You're going to learn to read between the lines a little bit, and this might involve you using some clinical intuition or hunches. And the more you know about a client, the more likely you are to get the meaning. Also, when you have a strong and established therapeutic relationship with the client, and even in the very beginning of that relationship, if you reinforce that if there's at any point anything that you say or imply in session that is off base or inconsistent with how the client is really feeling, or maybe what they feel or think about a circumstance, to make sure that it's known to them that they have the option to say to you, hey, that's off base, or yeah, you partially have it right, but here's another way of looking at it, or another way of understanding it. So again, how to reflect meaning. You're going to first pose open questions that ask the client to focus on the perceived significance and meaning of the story. Second, you're going to reflect meaning by listening carefully and taking educated guesses about why the story is important to the client. So we're going to revisit the open question. In terms of finding out the meaning behind a story or event, the open question is going to facilitate clients' identification and expression of meaning. So quite often we're not going to be able to get an understanding and broad-based awareness about what the meaning is by asking a bunch of closed questions. We really want to focus on asking open-ended questions to really hear about what stood out to the client in terms of their experience. Again, what were their emotional responses, and then using that information to present to the client potentially why it is that they're feeling a certain way, or why it is that this particular experience or event has impacted them as deeply as it has. Next, we're going to talk about summarizing. And summarizing is something that I've mentioned. I think it is the missed skill in techniques, and it's underutilized. What's great about summarizing is that if you are in doubt of where to go, quite often you can utilize one of these summary tools to reset the session, or to focus the session, or to make sure that you're understanding what the client is saying. So there's a couple types of summaries that we're going to talk about, more than two, but the first is going to be focusing summarizing. And this is an intervention that brings the discussion to bear on the major issues and themes, places the spotlight on the client's responsibility for the problem, and reminds the client of goals. When used in the beginning, it can tame a client that goes off and is challenging to keep on task. So an example of a focusing summary would be to say to the client, you know, Brittany, in the time frame that we've met, we've talked a lot about several different issues. We've talked about work, we've talked about your relationships, we've also talked about some challenges that you faced with your family. When you first came in for counseling, you indicated that you really wanted to talk more specifically about relationships. So I'm wondering if we can switch to exploring that issue more in depth for the remainder of our time together today. That's an example of a focusing summary. So we're taking the information that we've heard from the client, but we're directly indicating at the end of the summary that we want to focus on a particular topic or area, which is based primarily on the goal that the client has presented with in session. A signal summary tells the client that the counselor has digested what has been said and that the session can move on to the next topic. An example of that would be to say, before we move on to a different topic, I want to make sure that I've understood everything that we've talked about, as it relates to your relationship with your ex-husband. It sounds like you have an amazing relationship with your ex-husband. It's even better now that it has been in the past, and that even though there are some challenges now that he is seeing another individual and that has changed the dynamics of your relationship, you're still both firmly committed to parenting and believe that that's something that the two of you can continue to work on together. Tell me what else you would like to talk about today. So that's a signal summary saying we're done, we're closing the door, the can is empty, guys, on the discussion about the ex-husband, and we're signaling that we're going to go ahead and open a new can to explore with the client. A thematic summary is a theme. A theme is a pattern of content, feelings, or meanings that the client returns to again and again. The thematic summary helps the counselor make a connection that the client might not be able to see. With time, themes and patterns become more clear. So an example of a thematic summary would be, so Michael, thank you again for sharing all of this information in session. I'd like to highlight some things that I'm hearing. And what I'm hearing from you is really associated with this amount of transition and loss that you've experienced in the past 2 or 3 months. First, you talked about your dog dying. Then you talked about the transition from being a manager to being somebody who is no longer in a management position. And then you also talked about the challenges of being a parent and seeing your children move forward developmentally, but also losing some components of that relationship as they've matured. So that's a thematic summary. The theme in that is transition and loss. And so what I'm doing is calling it what it is. So I'm saying there's a theme that I see specifically related to loss and transition. And then I'm pointing out to the client exactly what those things are that they've experienced that connect to that theme. The planning summary is a summary that basically entails the review of progress, plans, and agreements made during the session. This brings closure and provides mutually agreed upon direction. So the planning summary is quite often what is used at the very end of a session. And this is typically used to reiterate to the client what they're going to do between now and the next time that you see the client, or something that you're going to be doing as well. So an example of that would be, Miley, thank you so much again for coming in today. Just to make sure we're on the same page about how things are going to proceed in our session, we talked about between now and the next time I see you, you're going to work on your resume, and you are going to bring an updated resume into our next session. Additionally, you're going to bring in examples of 2 or 3 jobs that you've applied to in the past for us to talk about. I'm also going to find out if we have anybody in our organization that specifically works with clients who are looking for career planning and doing mock interviews. I know that we might have some of those resources here at the organization, but between now and the next time I see you, I'm going to find that out. Do you have any questions or concerns about what you're going to accomplish between now and the next time I see you? Question mark. So with that planning summary, basically what we're doing is we're reviewing with the client what the expectations are for them between now, what the plan is for them between now and the next time I see them. And then also reiterating what we're going to be doing. Quite often with the planning summary, what will happen is the client will provide questions that they have or concerns that they have about what the plan is. Also, sometimes the plan or the direction might change when we summarize it because the client is feeling that maybe the topic area is or the expectation might be too much for them. And they might say, hey, listen, this might be more than I can handle. Can we reevaluate or relook at that? So that is reflecting, meaning, and summarizing. I hope that you've enjoyed this PowerPoint review. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions and or concerns. Thank you so much and have a great day.